Imagine a storm. The sky is blue-black, and the waves are rising and falling, and I'm too far out in the water. I'm swimming to a goal that at the time felt important or needed, but I'm too far out, and the waves take me. I'm a strong swimmer, and I try to get back, but eventually I have to give up as I see the coastline moving further and further away. I let the water take me. It carries me, and I stay buoyant, and I breathe, and I think to myself, maybe if I just relax, it will bring me back home. But after a while, I start to see, it looks like an island. It's a jagged cliff rising up out of the ocean. I can see that it's thick with forests, but I look for the kind of forests that I know, the underwater kelp, the spires of bronze kelp that stretch up cathedral-like, rising from the ocean floor onto the surface. But I can't see any. I look out, and in the distance, I think I see a little bit of brown. It's through a cove, and so I take a deep breath, and I dive down below the waves, and holding my breath, I swim, and I swim, and I fight the water, and I fight the waves, and I make it into the kelp forest. The kelp is very, very thin. It's not thick at all, but it's enough. And so the waves are less rising and falling there. They're calmer. In that kelp forest, I wrap myself in the kelp. Normally, when there are other otters around, we hold hands so that we don't float away, but there are no other otters here. So I wrap myself in the kelp like I was when I was a baby, and my mother used to go off hunting, and exhausted, I slowly fall asleep. I wake up the next morning, and I'm so tired and also so hungry. I'm starving, and I look down into the water to see what there is to eat. Hundreds and hundreds of urchins, spiky invertebrates, line the ocean floor. They're blue, they're black, they're red, they're green, they're purple, and they're everywhere. And I'm so excited. So I dive down and I pick up a rock, I tuck the rock under my arm, and I select a giant red urchin, and I swim up to the surface. I lie on my back, and I balance the urchin on my stomach, and I crack it open. The spines part, but there's nothing really inside. It's almost like the urchin is dead. Well, it's not dead, but all animals have eggs. It's what represents life. It represents connection, and this one, there are no eggs. It's just gray. It must be a bad urchin. So I throw it away and I dive down. This time I select a green one, the same thing. I dive down again, this time a purple one. Again, the same thing. I crack them open, and I realize that there's nothing inside. There's none of the eggs that I'm looking for. It's like the urchin is some kind of zombie. But I need to eat, so I hunt and I eat. The days pass, and I look for other otters. I wonder where the others are. There must be other otters in this environment, but there don't seem to be any. At night, I go to sleep, and I wonder about the other otters back home. I wonder how they're doing, whether they're looking for me. I also find myself thinking about how we as otters were taught to always think about other species and how we're all connected. But here, it doesn't really make sense. There are these strange urchins and very little kelp, but I do notice that over the days, the kelp is starting to hold me more. The fronds grow over me, and I feel like it's getting more comfortable. It's getting more supportive. It's starting to hold me more and more. And I'm also starting to notice more fish. Schools of bright purple fish, tiny little nurseries are coming up. There's also a human, just one. And I find them watching me. I hide at first, but after a while I start to let them see me, and it feels like they're keeping an eye out for me, like they're maybe protecting me. Like if one day a storm came, I wouldn't get washed away. They would notice that I wasn't there wrapped up in the kelp overnight. And then one day I saw that the human was with other humans. And I saw that same as me, they had an urchin. They'd picked it up right from the kelp line, and they were cracking it open. But there was yellow inside. It looked like eggs. I swam closer. I wanted to see, were there eggs inside this urchin? As I got closer and closer, suddenly the human looked at me, and then something flew towards me. Their wrist flicked, and something sharp and spiky came towards me, and I swam and I dived down, and then I turned around and I saw these yellow eggs spilling down through the water. They had thrown the urchin to me. Were they sharing it? I kept my distance, and I came up to the surface and I looked on curiously. I couldn't help myself. I wanted to swim closer. What was happening? This time they looked at me and they gently pushed the urchin out towards me. It floated along the top and then it slowly sank down to the bottom. I retrieved it and swimming away a nice distance, I cracked it open and it was full of eggs. It seemed like the urchins were reconnecting. The environment, it seemed like it was changing. The kelp was holding me more. The urchins had eggs again. But the human wasn't alone. There were other humans, and I was still alone. There were no otters. Would that human even look out for me? That night, as though on cue, a massive storm came up. It was like the one that had come up and brought me to the islands in the first place. I was terrified. This time it was not going to take me, and I knew that the human might not even notice. It had its own humans. Why would it see if I was gone? I stayed as close to the rocky shoreline as I could, but the kelp was being ripped up and thrown about, so I remembered the cove I had first come into. That would be safe. I was sure of it, so I swam towards it, and as I entered the cove, I felt something else in the water, something big. So I started to move out. I was careful not to move too quickly. I didn't want to create any vibrations in the water that it might pick up that I was there. But something grabbed me and pulled me down, and turning around, snapping, it was my mother. And a whole lot of other otters. They all swam up to me and surrounded me. How did you get here? The storm, they told me, we were looking for you and it just swept us over. I started to tell them about the island. Things were reconnecting, and now they were here. The urchins, they had eggs again. The kelp, it seemed to be stronger and thicker. My mother looked at me and started laughing. Haven't you figured it out? You are the change. Us otters are keepers of the kelp. We restore balance. As you were eating all those urchins, you allowed the kelp to recover. The urchins couldn't eat the kelp anymore, and so there was more kelp. And so that's why you saw more fish. They had a nursery. They had a place to live. It was also good for the urchins. They started to eat again, and so they could have their own eggs. But why were there no otters here? I asked my mother. My mother looked sad at this. She said, we did have relatives here, but people came, people who had forgotten their own connection, people from distant waters came and they forgot their roles in the ecosystem, our role in the ecosystem, and how we are all interconnected. They took every one of us. They took our fur to sell and to trade. But it sounds like things are changing. The humans here shared things with you. They're reconnecting to the environment and their own principles. I looked towards the shoreline. I could see my human there. I wondered if they were looking for me. Do you trust me? I asked my mother. Of course. Let's swim towards them. Let's see what happens. We swam towards the human, and I could see that there were others there too. And when they saw me, they looked so happy. They looked so delighted, and suddenly I realized that they weren't just going to look out for me, but they were going to look out for me and my family now, and that we were all together, and everything was going to be okay. Come back into the room now. We are no longer sea otters, but I hope that taking you into this coastline off the Pacific Northwest gave you a glimpse into my world and the research that we are engaging with. Sea otters are returning to this island. They did come over in a storm. And what is amazing is that the way in which we're choosing to manage the area and think about the area is being guided by how we think about ourselves as humans. And so the people on this island are using their principles to guide how they want to manage and reconnect with the environment. And this is really complex. Sea otters have not been in this environment for 200 years. So the environment and the ecosystem is having to figure out how it's going to relate to this arrival of this new species. And us as humans are also trying to figure out how do we relate and understand this as well. And so these principles, respect, reciprocity, Giving and receiving, balance, interconnectedness, and seeking wise counsel are being used to guide how we think about sea otter return in the space. So moving forward, there's only one way to do it, and it's not alone. It's together, because everything is connected.